We continue now at the top of Daf Mem Tes Amud Aleph and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 49a. And the previous summit, the Gemara asked, how do we know that by a carbon ola, if it's not slaughtered in the north of the Azara, that is ma'akev, that is a requirement, and therefore it would be disqualified? And the Gemara suggested on the previous summit, since chatas is learned from ola is the source, it is the ikr, and chatas is the tafel, and we know it's ma'akev, we know it's a requirement by chatas, so you never have a situation where the tafel is stricter than the ikr, and therefore by ola, certainly it is a requirement as well. And the Gemara now asks, is it really true that we never find a situation where the tafel is more chamer, is stricter than the ikr? But we do find such a thing as follows. V'harei meiser, but what about meiser sheni? Dehu nifta, that meiser sheni, it can be redeemed. V'ilu lakuach bekasef meiser, but let's say you have what is purchased with the money of meiser sheni, so eino nifta, so that is not redeemed, even though that is a derivative of the meiser sheni, that's considered to be a tafel. Rashi explains, V'harei Meiser Sheni Dehu Nifta Afilu B'Yerushalayim. Meiser Sheni can be redeemed even if it has already arrived in Yerushalayim. Im Nitma, if it becomes Tameh. K'di Alfinan Milo Suchal Se'eso. We learned that out from the pasuk, says he can't carry it to Yerushalayim. But Ve'ein Se'es Ela Achila. But we interpret Se'es as meaning it can't be eaten. For example, even Tameh would qualify as not being able to eat it in Yerushalayim. Shenem Rav Yisa Masos, like we see in the pasuk, that the word Se'es can be used in that fashion, that it can mean, again, it can reference eating. And so again we say, Eino Nifta, it's not redeemed. When it comes to Lakuach Bekesef Meiser, it's not redeemable. Aliba de Rabbi Yehuda, as we'll see in a moment, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you can't redeem it. Alma Ika Tafel Chamer Me'ikr. You see that you do have an example where the Tafel is stricter than the Ikr. And the Gemara continues, the Tanan, as we learned in a Mishnah, this is a Mishnah in Meseches Meiser Sheni, Halakoach Bekesef Meiser, something that is bought, that is purchased with the money of Meiser Sheni, Shenitma, that becomes Tameh Yifta, it can be redeemed according to the Tanakama. However, Rabbi Yehuda says, Yikaver, it is buried, it cannot be redeemed. So you see it's stricter according to Rabbi Yehuda, cannot be redeemed. And the Gemara continues and answers, Hasam over there, Lo alima kedushase lemitvas pedione. The kedusha is not strong enough to take hold of the redemption. That's why it doesn't work in that situation. And Rashi explains, Hasam over there, mishum delo alim velo chumru. It's not a situation really of a stringency. It just doesn't have the power, so to speak, to be able to be redeemed, according to Rabbi Yehuda. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'harei tamura, but what about by a substitute animal? That's when a person takes an animal, he stands it next to an animal that's a carbon, and he says that this second animal should be a substitute for the first animal. A person is not allowed to do that, but if he does it, both of them are kodesh. Both of them are considered to be holy, the substitute animal as well, and the tamura is really a derivative. It is considered like a tafel, and it is stricter in a certain sense. The ilu kodshim lo chayli al balmum kavua. When it comes to kodshim, that does not take effect on an animal that has a permanent blemish. V'ilu ihi chayla, but when it comes to the tamura, it does take effect, so in a certain sense, it is stricter. Rashi explains, Kodshim lo chayli tchilas hektish. If you're going to make something hektish initially, eino chal al bal mum kavua. It's not going to take effect. The hektish won't take effect on an animal that has a permanent blemish. Li kodesh kedushas haguf. It's not going to get that kedushas haguf. Kedushas haguf means like kedushas mizbeach, like the animal itself can be a carbon and sacrifice on the mizbeach. Ela kedushas dam and bialma. The only kedusha it's going to get is what's called a monetary value kedusha. V'yotzen lechulin gemurin bepidyon. It can be totally redeemed to chulin through that redemption. It totally becomes chulin. V'afilu ligazes v'liyavin. In such an animal, even if you want to shear the animal, you want to work the animal, that's all permitted. It's completely chulin. Kedetanya v'perakot siulo b'seder yuma, as we learn in a brisa in perakot siulo in Meseches yuma. The brisa in yuma says this explicitly. Chomer b'tmura, that tmura is stricter in a certain sense. Shahatmura chala al balmum kavua, because again tmura is chala, takes effect even on an animal with a permanent blemish. Ve'ein yotze lechulin ligazes v'liyavin. It's not able to become chulin for the fact that you're able to shear it, you're able to work it. It's not able to fully become chulin. Masha'ein kain bezevach. That's not true by a regular carbon. And how do we know that? The gabe tmura ksiv, because by tmura it's written tov bera hishve balmum latam. That pasuk of tov bera is saying that a balmum is treated like a tam le'inyan tmura as far as tmura is concerned. Al kulam nemar v'hayahu tmurasu yakodesh. On all of them, meaning it doesn't matter if it has a mum, you still apply the pasuk of v'hayahu tmurasu yakodesh, that it is kodesh. Avol zevach rishon, but when it comes to the initial animal that was made a carbon, im kadam hekdesho es mumo. So if the hekdesh comes before the blemish, so then kadosh kedushas haguf ve'eno yotze lechulin, then it does have kedushas haguf, and it is not yotze lechulin ligazes v'liyaved. Then we do say that the kedusha is retained. Kedetanan bebechoros, like we learn in the Mishnah bechoros, kal hakadshim shekadam muman lehekdesham nifta. It says, but if the mum came first, if that came before the hekdesh, then it is redeemed. The yolif lamikra, and all of that is learned out from Sukkim. And the Gemara continues and answers Tamura with regards to Tamura Mikoach Kodshim Ka'asya. That Kedusha is coming from Kodshim, and Rashi explains Kodshim Mikoach Chulin Ka'asu. Rashi has a slightly different girsa. Kodshim that comes from Chulin, meaning Lo Chala Aleim Kedusha Kodemis. You didn't have any earlier Kedusha, it's just an animal that was Chulin that's made into Kodshim. Avol Tamura, but when it comes to Tamura, Ba Mikoach Kedusha Kodemis, that comes from an earlier Kedusha. That substitute animal is deriving the Kedusha from a holy animal. Hilkach lav tafel chamer min ha'ikru. Therefore, it's not considered a situation of a tafel that's stricter than the ikr. To ha'chomer de ikru, that really is that's the stringency deriving from the ikr, and so therefore, again, that would not be an example where the tafel is stricter than the ikr. And the Gemara continues, Hare Pesach, but what about Karban Pesach? Dehu eino ton smicha u'nesachim u'tenufas chazav v'shok. A Karban Pesach does not require smicha, leaning upon the animal. It doesn't require nesachim, which are libations. It doesn't require the waving of the chazav v'shok, the waving of the breast and the thigh. V'ilu moser didei, but if you have the leftover from Karban Pesach, that's an animal that's a Karban Pesach that wasn't brought at the proper time, it's considered to be a shlamim, so there it's stricter. Ton smicha u'nesachim u'tenufas chazav v'shok. It requires smicha, nesachim, and tenufas. So again, it seems the derivative is stricter than the original source. And the Gemara answers to that, Pesach, with regards to Karban Pesach, B'shar Yemos Hashana, when a Karban Pesach is brought during other times of the year, not at the time of the Karban Pesach, so Shlamim, who it actually has the status of Shlamim, and therefore it's not even really considered a derivative of Karban Pesach. And Rashi explains, Shlamim, who again, Moser is considered to be a Shlamim, V'lo Moser Pesach Mikri. It's not actually called Moser Pesach, L'michshavei Tafel. Therefore, it's not considered to be a Tafel. It's not considered to be a derivative. And the Gemara continues, V'ibo Yisayim, if you want, I could say, Amar Kra, the Pasuk says Ha'ola, it says the word Ha'ola, and therefore we understand, B'mekoma Tehei, it should remain in its place. And the point over here is that maybe we're not learning that Ola requires that it's Ma'akev, that it be in the north of the Azar, from the fact that it is the Ikr, and the Tafel can never be stricter than the Ikr. Rather, we're actually learning it from the word in the Pasuk Ha'ola. That teaches us that it is required that it be slaughtered in the north. Rashi explains, V'ibo Yisayim, if you want, I could say, Ikuva de Ola mehacha. Really, the fact that it's a requirement by Ola is learned from here. Dechsiv b'makom ha'ola chazar v'shan. It's like repeating it. The pasuk is repeating that word. Limeid makom shekavato la'ola liolam hu mekom. It's teaching that the place that's established for the Ola, that has to be its place. Again, that the tzafon, that the north, is a requirement. And the Gemara continues, Asham menolan deboit tzafon. From where do we know that a Karban Asham, it needs to be slaughtered in the north of the Azara? And the Gemara says, Dechsiv, as it's written in the pasuk, b'makom asher yishchatu esa ola yishchatu esa asham. It says in the place where the Ola is slaughtered, that's where the Asham is slaughtered. The Gemara says, Eshkechon Shchita, so we find the source by Shchita that the slaughtering needs to be done in the north. Kabbalah Minolan, where do we know that the receiving of the blood by the Karban Asham needs to be done in the north? The Gemara says, V'yas Damo Yizrok, it says Damo Yizrok, you have to throw the blood, it says it right in that same pasuk, and so therefore we understand Kibul Damo Nami B'tzafon, that the receiving of the blood also is in the north. The Gemara continues and asks, Mekabel Atzmo Menolan, from where do we know the Mekabel has to be standing himself in the north? He can't be standing somewhere else and then receiving the blood in the north. And the Gemara says to that, Damo vs Damo. It doesn't simply say Damo, it says vs Damo, that's an inclusion, and so therefore we understand that the Mekabel also has to be standing in the north. The Gemara continues and asks, Eshkechon la mitzvah. So now we have a source that there's a mitzvah lechatzchila by Karban Asham to be in the north. But la'akev menolan, from where do we know la'akev? How do we know that it's absolutely required, that it would be disqualified if it's not done? And the Gemara says to that, Kra achrina ksiv, there's another pasuk that's written. It says v'shachat es hakeves, also in the context of a Karban Asham. It says v'shachat es hakeves, and we learn from there also, again, it's a repetition of the requirement of the north that shows that it's absolutely required. And we will take a look at the two psukim. The first pasuk that was quoted, B'mkom asher yishchatu esa ola yishchatu esa asham v'yas damo yizrok al mizbeach saviv, again mentioning that in the same place that the ola is slaughtered, that's where the asham is slaughtered, and also mentioning the zrikas adam. And then the other pasuk that was quoted, V'shachat es hakeves b'mkom asher yishchat es hachatos v'yas ola, the keves is slaughtered where the chatos and the ola are slaughtered, b'mkom hakodesh ki kachatos ha'asham hu lakohen kodesh kadashim hu. So again, that is the repetition that teaches that it is required. And Rashi explains, Yishchatu es ha'asham v'yes damo, it says slaughter the asham and its blood, meaning to say, b'mekom shchitaso, in the same place of the slaughtering, tehei kabol as damo, that's where the receiving of the blood should be. And then the Gemara said, damo v'yes damo, the fact that it says v'yes damo, that includes the makabel, midamotzi l'mechtav yishchatu es ha'asham v'damo yizrok, since it could have just said v'damo yizrok, uchsiv v'yes damo, and it says v'yes, it adds that on, es l'rabos es ha'makabel, the word es includes the one who is receiving the blood. And the Gemara also said, V'shachar es hakeves, that it repeats this requirement to show that it is absolutely required. That's ba'asham mitzora ksiv. That's written specifically by the asham brought by a mitzora, by a leper. Again, it repeats this halacha of where the slaughtering should be done. Shana hakasav olav li'akev, the pasuk repeats it to show that it is ma'akev, to show that it is required. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'hai lahachi udasa, this pasuk of V'shachar es hakeves, is it really used for this, to say that the north is a requirement? But haimi boile lechidatanya, isn't it needed for what is taught in the following brisa? The brisa says, Davar shahaya bichlal, something that was included in the generalization, V'yatza lidon b'davar hachadash, but then it is taken out to learn something new. Iyatar rashoy la'achziro lechlalu, you can't return it to the general rule, ad she'achzirenu hakasav lechlalu beferish, until the Torah returns it explicitly again to that general rule. Ketzad, how so? V'shachar es hakeves, this pasuk that we quoted before, it says, V'shachar es hakeves b'mekom asher yishchat es hachatos v'es, it says that the sheep is slaughtered in the same place as the chatos and the ola. B'mekom hakodesh ki kachatos ha'asham hu, it says again that the asham is like the chatos, and again, this is by the asham mitzora. And the brisa says, she'ein tal v'lomer kachatos ha'asham, the pasuk doesn't need to say kachatos ha'asham. Ma tal v'lomer kachatos ha'asham, why does it say kachatos ha'asham in the pasuk? Lefi sheyotza asham mitzora lidon b'davar hachadash, because asham mitzora has a unique halacha. By asham mitzora, there's a halacha of bebohen yad or bohen regel. There's a halacha of the application of the blood to the thumb, to the big toe, v'ozen yamonis, and to the right ear. So therefore, it had this davar hachadash, this unique halacha. So yachol lo yeheton matan damen ve'imurin legavi mizbeach. One might think that it would not require the application of the blood and the burning of the sacrificial portions on the mizbeach. Talmud lomar, that's why the pasuk says kachatos ha'asham hu. It compares this asham to the chatos. Machatos tu'una matan damen ve'imurin legavi mizbeach. Just like a chatos requires application of the blood and the burning of the sacrificial portions on the mizbeach, af asham mitzora, so too the asham mitzora ton matan damen ve'imurin legavi mizbeach. It requires the application of the blood and the burning of the sacrificial portions on the mizbeach, and so that's really what this pasuk is used for. How can you say it's used for the requirement of the north? And Rashi explains, L'chidatanya, isn't the pasuk used for what's taught in this brisa, that tzarech la'achziro l'chlalu, you have to return it to the general rule. Here the general rule is talking about the matan damim and the emurim on the mizbeach. Hilkach le'inyan shchitas tzafon nami, and so therefore, if that is true, when it comes to slaughtering in the north also, boy la'achziro, don't we need to return it to that general rule? Di lo hadar kasve begavya, ki hechi de'ahadre l'matan damo, have amina loni b'it tzafon, because if it's not going to write that you should return it to that halacha, just like we're returning it to the halacha of matan damo, of the application of the blood, one might think that the north is not required, meaning to say, the way Rashi understands the question, is that the reason why this pasuk needs to repeat kachatos ha'asham is to return this asham to the regular halachas, to say again that there's matan damim and emurim lagavi mizbeach. And if that's true also, maybe that's the reason it's written in terms of north, just to say, don't think that north doesn't apply, it actually does apply. You might think by asham mitzora, since it's unique with bohen yad, bohen regelos, and yamonis, maybe the halach of north doesn't apply, and that's why it needs to be repeated, but then it would not be being used to say that it's ma'akev, to say that it's an absolute requirement. And Rashi continues, you can't return it to that rule, that it should be like the other types of karbonos, let's say, within that category. And so therefore, again, you need to return it to that and to say that the same halachas applies. That the same halachas apply. Sheyotza asham mitzora mechlal zos torasa asham. And the point of the brisa is that the asham of the mitzora is different than the general asham of zos torasa asham, the general laws of the asham. Davikasa bekulu v'yasdamo yizrok al mizbeach. It says by all ashams you're going to throw the blood on the mizbeach. Afkan, so too over here, l'shchita safon nami la'achzirohu deshana. Maybe it's just just for slaughtering in the north, we have to repeat it in order to return it to that general rule. Maybe that's why it's repeated. It's not repeated to show that it's ma'akev, to say that it's required, but just repeated for the sake of Asham Mitzorah, which one might think is different. And the Gemara continues and answers, Imkain, if so, if the idea of the pasuk was just to say Asham Mitzorah should be like other Ashams and the north is required, that was the whole purpose. It wasn't repeating it to say that it was absolutely required, to say that it was ma'akev. So then nichtov b'hai, so then just write it over here. V'lo nichtov b'hai, and don't write it over there. Rashi explains, lichtov shchita safon b'asham mitzorah. The pasuk could have just written slaughter in the north by asham mitzorah. V'lo nichtov gabe zos torah asham. You don't even need to write it by zos torah asham, by the general law of the asham. V'nigmar klolo minei, and then you'll just learn the general rule from there. Umi the kasvei hacha v'hacha, the fact that it's written twice here and here, liikuvahu, that shows that it is in fact a requirement, that it is ma'akev. But the Gemara continues and asks, Hanichi svira lon yotza lidom b'davar hachadash. All of this works out if we hold that by a case of yotza lidom b'davar hachadash, iyuhu delo gamer michlalo. So the case that's specified, that's unique, it can't be learned from the general rule. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Memtes Amud Beis.